Hello and welcome to your guide on getting through an inspection when you're the seller. The buyer is bringing the inspector in to pick your house apart. And today our guide is Amy. Amy, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. All right. So Amy is amazing at this. Seriously, Amy gets folks through this period, which is a challenging period on the seller side because the buyer has made an offer. We've worked out an agreement, but now they're bringing the inspector in. It's the inspector's job to find problems, and then the buyer expects to renegotiate. So Amy, how do you set the seller up for success heading into this inspection period?
I think the most important thing to do is just trying to remove emotion if possible.
Man.
You've lived in the house for 10, 15 years. You've loved it. You haven't had any crazy issues, or maybe you've had a few here and there, but they've all been fixed, So it can be a very disheartening thing to have a 65-page report about your house that everything is wrong with it, So removing emotion is really step one.
Yeah, that is a great step. And then, I think setting the expectation, you said it, 65 pages. That is not uncommon for a really great house.
Yep. Even new construction, they find things.
Yes. Yeah. So what actually happens? So the buyer hires an inspector, and then how does the process actually go from that point?
Yeah. So typically the inspector they're looking for defects. That is their job. And so, but they're also not certified in every area of the home building process or, the components of the house. So their job is just to shine a light on things that they think are questionable.
Yep.
And then they're going to recommend further evaluation by licensed professionals in that trade.
Right.
So
they find, for example, something's wrong with the HVAC. They're not completely taking it apart, diagnosing the situation. They're just like, hey, this doesn't look right. This isn't the code. You've got to get it further evaluated.
Correct. And if there's even the slightest bit of question in their mind, they have to put it in the report. Yeah. So a lot of times things can be very easily explained or identified by a licensed professional. We just got to get them in and get them to actually evaluate it.
I think that's a really good point. And I think if people look at it from the inspector's standpoint, they have a lot of liability, right? And so from the inspector's standpoint, they are going to err on the side of noting something or reporting something versus the opposite direction. And I think that can be helpful for the seller to know that's the inspector's perspective on it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how long go ahead.
I was just going to say, everything costs more to a buyer too than it actually costs. So a lot of times they will see these things as questionable, and the cash register just starts adding up in their minds. But in all reality, when we get people in there, we can oftentimes, easily identify any issues and correct them in most cases.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what happened. Is we're going to get to that on what happens next. How long is the inspector usually at the house? Does the seller stay? Who's there? Like, what does that actually look like for someone who hasn't sold a house before?
Yeah, most inspectors will not inspect with the seller present. It can lead to problems for obvious reasons. And now with COVID, they don't want anybody there,
right.
Just the inspector. So, the inspection should take about 3 to 4 hours, depending on the size of the house.
Yeah.
And also if you're having additional inspections done, if you want to have mold testing done or any kind of, infrared scan of windows and energy efficient testing, you would want to allow time for that too. And also let the seller know up front that you need it. That's from the buyer side.
Yeah. So, that's a good point. I'm using the term inspection, and we're talking about the home inspection because that is a big aspect, but really this is a due diligence period where the buyer can do any sort of inspections they want. And so, as you mentioned, they may want to do mold testing, and they may want to get a survey and radon testing. And this is their period to do those tests, and it is their responsibility to pay for them and do them, but they have the right to do that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those things are wrong from the seller's standpoint.
Correct. Yeah. So you've got to be prepared. Every buyer is different,
Yep.
and, you know, they may decide to do more extensive testing than others.
Yeah. And I've seen sellers get frustrated with that, but that's not a personal attack on the house. I mean, it's typically more from the buyer's standpoint of just their comfort level personally of anything they're buying.
Exactly. And always remembering at the end of the day, you have a buyer who wants your house. So it's a great day. Let's make it
That's
work.
that's interesting perspective as well, because this isn't free for the buyer and these
Right.
additional tests are not free. So if a buyer is doing 3 or 4 things, they are getting more financially committed to the process as they go.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right. So they've had the test, they've had the inspection, had whatever done. What happens at that point from the seller's perspective? What happens next? What does the seller have to do?
Yeah. So the buyer gets all their inspections and they come up with a list of priority items, and they're going to send it over in an amendment to address concerns.
Yep.
And these can be as many as 1 or 2 simple things, or it can be 2 pages long. They
Yep.
want the entire summary of the report
Yep.
addressed.
Yep.
So from a seller standpoint, it can be very overwhelming to
For
see
sure.
that list and think, how am I ever going to save this? You
Yep.
know, you sometimes sellers just want to push back and say,
Yep.
not doing anything.
Mhm.
But it's really important to just take it one line item at a time.
Yep.
And sometimes things can be easily explained, and check it off the list. And as many of those as we can address easily, the closer we are to closing.
For sure. Because the seller's trying typically to do as little as possible. The buyer's trying to get as much as possible. And so it's just a second round of negotiations similar to the first round.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it can also be done, and I mean, I actually like this. It can also be done where the seller can give a concession instead of actually doing the repairs, right? Why do some sellers prefer to either give a little discount on the price or some additional closing costs instead of doing the actual repairs?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to offer the concession.
Mhm.
You know, nobody wants to believe that something could fall apart before closing, but if it did and you spent all that money making repairs,
Yep.
you know, and to have another buyer come in and want an entirely different list of items, you
Yep.
know, you want to weigh the risks involved of that. So we generally recommend to offer a concession, but do it in a way that's educated,
Yeah.
and get your estimates, partner with great vendors, and, you know, come up with something that's reasonable that you guys can, you know, negotiate on and come up with a win-win.
Because it's way easier to get that negotiation done when you have those actual vendor estimates than just, hey, take $2,000 off the price and, we're not doing anything. If there's no backup to that and no one knows what the work is going to cost, it's really hard to get that accepted. But on the flip side, if you have them listed out $500 for this, $75 for that, oftentimes you find that that gets to a resolution easier.
Yeah, and it really shows a good step in the buyer's direction.
Oh,
You
that's
know,
true.
you're showing an effort to address their concerns. You know, you're not going to probably address all of them depending on the list that you get,
Yeah.
but if you can show that you've made a really nice, reasonable attempt to do so, then chances are the buyer is going to receive that much better than just a quick, you know, here's $1,000 response.
Yeah. And what sort of things are the buyers typically requesting? I mean, is it everything like paint the house and buy me new furniture, or is it more nuts and bolts? Like, what's the buyer typically suggesting, and what's typically getting agreed to?
You know, I wish I could say it was the same every time, but it's really not. It can be, you know, it can range from just small, minute things like door stops. You
Yep.
know, you wouldn't think about things like that, but I've seen it.
For sure.
Up to real structural issues.
Yep.
And so, you know, you just really want to identify what those priority items are. What are safety concerns?
Yep.
Those are typically the ones that we find are the biggest deal breakers, and the
Yep.
things that are going to come up on the next inspection. If you don't do it for this buyer, it's not going to go away for the next buyer. And so it's
Yeah.
better to save this buyer than start all over.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So any defects and safety items that would show up in this report and with this buyer, if they didn't move forward and you now know, hey, I've got this problem that you didn't know about before, you do have to disclose that to the next buyer. And that obviously can be a problem for buyer number 2 or 3.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how does this period get wrapped up? So the buyer has the inspection, they make the request, the seller hopefully is doing as few of those things as possible or maybe giving a concession. But how does it end? Can the buyer just keep asking and asking and asking, or is there an end point to this round of negotiations?
You know, it's definitely going to be that. It's a second negotiation on the house. So, you know, I would say if you've taken the time, you've gotten together some good estimates, you've put forth a good effort to address, you know, a good bit of their concerns, chances are it can be worked out. You know, it shouldn't need to go back and forth too many times, although it can.
Sure.
But, you know, usually you're going to send over a counter response and, you know, hopefully they agree.
Yeah. And then if they do, the due diligence period wraps up. And at that point, the buyer doesn't have the ability to back out of the contract anymore, and they can't keep coming back to you with more and more things.
Correct. They can't back out for due diligence type of concerns.
Yeah.
That ends that period. So you can breathe easy as a seller from that point.
Awesome. All right. So Amy, what would you say is the most important, or maybe the one secret piece of advice that has helped you get so many sellers through this period? What do you think is the most important thing for sellers to do or know?
I think the most important thing is don't be afraid to ask for more time. Need it? Take the time you need to get good, thorough inspections on the items that they're asking for. And, you know, just extend due diligence. Yes, they could back out for any reason during that time period, but it's worth the risk knowing that you could put forward something that meets their concerns and, you know, you move on to the next step.
I really like that. I didn't think you were going to say that, but that's really good advice, because a lot of times I have seen sellers get pressured into making a kind of uninformed decision because we didn't have all the data yet. When you make an uninformed decision, I think you have a higher chance of it not being a wise decision.
Right.
Yeah, love that. Awesome. Well, Amy, thank you.